Is your mic on? Okay, you want to go ahead and turn it? Yeah. I think we're going to get started.
Hello, everyone.
Well, I'll do the intro here. Okay. All right, good evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to Dyer Observatory. Who's here for the first time this evening? Wow, I'm always impressed with how many newcomers we have at every single event we do, and I'm not joking. Every single event, it's like half the audience is brand new. So welcome to everybody. We're excited to be up here. We're glad we're outside, and it's not really sweltering. It's a little warm, but it's going to cool off some more. But thank you all for joining us this evening. So I'm Dr. Billy Teets, and to get started with this evening, I've got just a couple of announcements, and then we're going to dive right into this fantastic talk. So we have additional events coming up this year. We've got additional Meet the Astronomer lectures. We've got some telescope nights. We've also got at least one open house planned. All of our events we ticket through Eventbrite, whether they're free or paid for. So if you go to our website, just find the link on there for purchasing tickets for some event. That'll take you directly to the Eventbrite page. And when you get there, there's a little blue button at the top that says follow. Be sure to click on that, because whenever we add a new event, you're going to get a notification for it. And if there's something that kind of catches your eye, you can click on an event, and it's also set up to where you can get a reminder about that event. Okay, so we hope to have you up here for many, many more of our events. So our program tonight, we're going to go for about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Then we're going to open up the floor to a question and answer session. In addition, we're going to be live streaming to YouTube this evening, so folks that are joining us from home will also have an opportunity to watch this or see this fantastic talk, and also have an opportunity to ask questions. So if you're watching from YouTube, be sure to go ahead and pop your questions into the chat, and we'll read those out for you when we get to the end of the program. And then after the Q&A session, you are welcome to go up and visit the Seaford Telescope, especially those that are here for the very first time. Looks like we're going to have a nice evening. Our target this evening is the moon. It's full moon, which sounds great, and we're going to have a nice view of it. It's going to be pretty low, though, so you might see it as kind of a colorful strawberry moon this evening. June is the strawberry moon. So, but with that, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Girish Duvvuri is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Vanderbilt University. He likes to read and think about possible worlds, and then even found a way to get paid to do it from a scientific perspective by researching how the light from small stars shapes the evolution of their planets. He indulges the literary perspective off the clock by reading, watching, and playing with speculative fiction narratives. So without further ado, let's introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Girish Duvvuri. Thank you for coming.
Hello, everyone. Like I've said to a couple of people here, I really thought this was going to be 20 people max, so let's see how the order of magnitude works out. So just to start off, I'd like to explain why this talk exists, which is when I started college, I wanted to study how the universe worked. And to me, that meant studying physics and studying literature. Astronomy was a happy accident. But this talk is one where I get to celebrate all three of those things, so I hope you'll enjoy the show. And I'm going to start by giving kind of a mini version of the whole talk right now. I'm going to explain how Tarzan, Superman, and Carl Sagan are all related through a single story. In the early 1910s, Edgar Rice Burroughs, who is already famous for having written Tarzan, wrote a book about a man transported to another planet. And because he was on this other planet with different physics, he was granted superhuman abilities. He could jump really far, effectively flying. He could withstand terrible injury. And he found himself in a desolate landscape, a dying world. And he was the only one who could save it. This is the first novel, A Princess of Mars, is the story of John Carter, which was adapted into a movie that had mixed reception. But you can see how some of those ideas, the idea of because you're on a different planet, you have different skills. That carried over into Superman. The idea that some worlds were old and dying compared to the Earth. That was an idea that carried through to Superman and was actually related to how we understood planet formation at the time. It isn't what the scientists thought, but because of something scientists thought, it was an idea that went into the popular consciousness. At the same time, Edgar was concerned about what he saw as like the downfall of the masculine, the loss of wild spaces. Tarzan and John Carter are both about this. What does it mean to be alone out in the wilderness? And what does it mean when a society doesn't have that wilderness to go out into? And so the social issues of the time and the scientific understanding of the world at the time gave rise to this particular story. Later, it would become huge. It had comic adaptations. It spawned a more than 10-book series, and it was a series that Carl Sagan very much loved. When he was young, he started out simply enjoying the narrative, but at some point he started thinking, wait, is Mars actually like that? And he attributes the Barsoom, this vision of John Carter's Mars, to why he got into planetary science. Has anyone ever heard of a palimpsest? Great, at least one person. I was not allowed to name this talk Mars, Mirror, and Palimpsest when I first gave it because they thought no one would know what it is. But the idea is certain types of writing media, like wax tablets or parchment or papyrus. Sometimes the medium was so important in that it was like really good. Having a piece of parchment without a scar or blemish from the original animal is really rare. So if someone wrote something on that piece of paper or parchment, the parchment was more important to a later generation. And so they would scrape off the ink and write over it. And so there exist these documents in history that have been written over, in some cases hundreds of times. And through careful imaging, we can actually reconstruct parts of these old narratives. The way we tell stories in our culture are very much palimpsests. Stories write over each other, borrowing ideas in ways we don't necessarily recognize. And I'm going to try to tell the story of the palimpsest that is Mars. Let's start in the very beginning. The first thing we knew about Mars was that it was a red thing in the sky that didn't move like the stars, much like other planets. So the association with red quickly became tied to fire, war, blood. So Nergal on the left, who I believe was Sumerian, a Sumerian god, was tied to both war and fire and pestilence. Mars became an adaptation of the Greek god Ares, was tied to war. Mangal is the many Sanskrit family languages name for Mars. Another name for Mangal translates to iron-bodied. And Tyr effectively adapted stories of Mars to tell this story, again, associated with the same planet. Across all these cultures, they associated these gods and common concepts with the same planet. To the point that, and something you may not realize, is that the ancient world was in constant communication all across the Eastern Hemisphere. Ideas about how metals worked in alchemy and how they connected to the planets through astrology traveled between Greece, India, Japan, Russia. It moved everywhere, to the point where our days of the week are named for the planets and named for metals. So we start with the day of the sun, gold, the day of the moon for silver, Mars, Tuesday, Tew, another name for Tyr. And then the rest of the days of the week are other metals. You can think about the list. But that idea, because documents were constantly circulated across the Eurasian continent and Africa, we all have them. Like, I grew up speaking Telugu. Mangalavaram is Tuesday, is Mars Day. Mardi in French, for example, or Spanish, I don't know. But you see how you might not have expected all of these to happen to be the same, but they are because of how stories move. But that's all we knew about Mars for the longest time, right? Red thing in the sky that moves weird. Once we started coming up with telescopes and we could start to see things, it became a world. It was more than this fuzzy, it became a fuzzy blob. And this is kind of the theoretical perfect version of what you could see from the ground. The contemporaries of Galileo saw a much fuzzier version of this. And people started seeing patches of dark that they called, there was a lot of debate at first. This is one of the first maps of Mars ever drawn. I forget what he called the dark things, but the next guy, Giovanni Schiaparelli, referred to them as canali, which is a word that can be translated multiple ways. He meant it in the context of channels. It looked to him like giant, empty riverbeds that had been carved by water. But he didn't even think that's what it was. He just thought, it looks like that. This got translated into English as canals, which is a fairly natural assumption, I think. And someone went wild with this. Percival Lowell became obsessed with the idea that Mars had canals that were made by an intelligent species. He was a very well-connected, very public figure who was in the news often for discussing his Mars theories. And part of why he thought that they were effectively created is that became possible around that time. We had started digging the Panama Canal. The idea of planet-changing scope and scale of projects was not unthinkable. And at the time, the understanding of planet formation was that there's these big clouds of gas and dust, and they collapse into a disk, and then the planets form. This is very much the story we tell today. But a part of that story that was still under debate was what starts first. At the time, one person's idea was maybe it gets cold on the outside first, and so the outermost planets form first. And then it gets progressively cooler as you go deeper inside. And so Jupiter and Saturn are the oldest worlds. Mars is our immediate older sibling, and Venus is our younger. This is an idea that was not popular in the scientific consensus, but it took hold of the people's imagination. There were stories about a version of the Old and New Testament happening on Saturn. When Percival Lowell was writing, he was writing in a public consciousness that was thinking of Mars as an older, dying world. And this is contemporary, of course, with Edgar Rice Burroughs, a few decades later. People have always been a little amazed, both in good and bad ways, about what we spend on telescopes. Percival Lowell spent quite a bit of money on one particular telescope, and I guess Kirk Soap thought that was important for some reason. But like I said, very well connected, very public figure. He ended up shifting from astronomy to study Japan from a hotel in Tokyo without ever leaving the hotel, and he became an expert consulted by the US government. People are weird. But the observatory he founded to look at these canals, Lowell Observatory, still exists today. Much like this one, it runs public events with a telescope open to the public. And this is a legacy left behind by one person's obsession with dark, fuzzy blobs on a red circle. But of course, after we move, we start thinking about, once you start thinking about worlds and world-scale things, it becomes possible to think about the costs of war. H.G. Wells saw the potential for what some of the weapons he had seen could do before World War I. And he was afraid of the damage. He had seen some of the costs of what the British Empire's kind of zealous reaction to certain bits of rebellion were, and he thought, the bigger and scarier we make our weapons, the greater the cost will be. And he envisioned these giant walking tripods with heat rays that could burn entire acres all at once, and clouds of black death that preceded World War II, but when mustard gas came along, people immediately related it to the clouds of black death from War of the Worlds. The way we think about what exists in our world is shaped by the stories we read. Another idea, though, is that he was concerned with, much like Edgar Rice Burroughs, as a society moves further and further away from the physical, as it becomes more and more intelligent, maybe it loses empathy. Maybe these beings would be giant brain figures who don't care at all about the human virtues. And his Martians end up underestimating humanity and Earth, in part because of their extreme intelligence. And the great irony of War of the Worlds is that they are destroyed by bacteria, which is exactly what they viewed humans as. There is a wonderful radio broadcast from Orson Welles that was an adaptation of the War of the Worlds. There have been some stories that exaggerate this, but some people did believe that an invasion of the Earth was happening as this radio broadcast was played. Longer story there about newspapers and radio not liking each other. But the concerns of society after World War II, of course, were the bomb. This was H.G. Wells' nightmare come true, right? A completely catastrophic weapon that was capable of causing damage on a planetary scale. This concern immediately propagated to, well, Mars is a world. Maybe we can go there. Maybe it's a last escape, or maybe it's barren because of nuclear weapons. This was an idea that came up a lot. And of course, the fear of Russia during the Cold War drove a lot of these narratives of Mars as an escape. Russia, on the other hand, did have some stories, or the Soviet Union had some stories where the red planet was in fact a communist utopia because it could be rescued from the legacy of Earth. Carl Sagan, in particular, was a great activist against nuclear weapons, in part because he understood the cost of those weapons, but also because he recognized that Mars was not, in fact, a hospitable place. We had started sending landers, we knew the surface was barren, inhospitable, and that changed the way we viewed the planet. Ray Bradbury, who was writing in this time, was writing against the backdrop of the Cold War. He also had this deep nostalgia tempered by wariness of kind of like small town America that he grew up in. He loved it, but he also knew that it came with a legacy of oppression, of genocide, and so he wanted to imagine a world where that wasn't quite what had happened. At one point, he actually writes, "I wanted to write a world where black people could run away from all this." But even in these stories, he couldn't let go of the legacy of America. That scene on the left there is a child asking his father, "Where did all the Martians go?" And the father tells him, "Look in the mirror. We are the Martians now." In attempting to, what was there has been lost. It was tragic, but we are here now, and let's make the most of it, was what Ray Bradbury tried to settle on in his troubled nostalgia. Here's Carl Sagan with the Viking lander, or not on Mars, but at a region where they're testing, I believe in Utah. And from nuclear weapons, of course, the other thing he moved on to was talking about climate change. Once the Cold War threat was not so big, the key concern that faced humanity for many science fiction authors was climate change and this idea that can we humans think on a planetary scale? Can we act in ways that will matter for centuries? A project that you will never see the fruits of. Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy is effectively this, that you're, I forget how the George Washington quote goes, but you plant trees for fruit you'll never eat. Mary Robinette Kowal wrote Lady Astronaut of Mars, which to me is a very optimistic story. You might not think so. It starts with a meteor wiping out Washington, D.C. Shortly before the Apollo program. The fantasy, the optimism here is that when the Secretary of Agriculture is made president, because he's the only one left because he was on tour in Kansas, people actually listen to him when he realizes, oh, this might affect crops in a few decades. And they actually put together an international space program to maybe settle Mars, to at least create backups of some kind on the moon, and start that decade-long experiment. The fantasy here, of course, is that we're able to mobilize within years of such a catastrophic event. And part of the fantasy here maybe is that that's what it takes. It takes an immediate threat. You can't see what's going to happen 100 years ahead of you, but you can see what happened when a meteor hit. As you get further and further from that event, it becomes harder and harder for the space program to get funding, so maybe not that optimistic after all, but it's a wonderful series. I highly encourage you to read it. There's also a short story that was the start of the series that you can find for free online. James S.A. Corey's The Expanse is another example of this, where Earth is contrasted against Mars, where Earth is a place of decadence, of not having valued what we had and let it be destroyed. The oceans have risen. The majority of the population lives under a form of welfare that prevents people from accessing higher, people can't go to university unless they pass a really hard exam or they win a lottery. And so it's an idea that provides for everyone but doesn't necessarily make the most of the people themselves, like squandered potential, which is contrasted against Mars, which became a militarized society with one common goal, settled by a number of countries that were overpopulated, China, India, and the idea being that all of these people can live for the Mars that is a century away. They all believe in this dream that one day they can terraform it. And so Mars as the idea that you need that kind of militarism, that you need that kind of organizing authority to get these long projects done, is an idea that goes back, of course, to Rome. Rome has given us a lot of things you may not realize. For example, salary. Salary comes from salt, which was part of the wages paid to Roman soldiers. So just, little ways that things carry through that you might not know about. Of course, other more comical things, maybe terraforming Mars is not a great idea. We live now in an era where science is not separate from the public in the ways it was during the nobility doing science. It's not the province of a few wealthy industrialists or people who have money for giant observatories. We live now in a time where all of you can directly engage with what science is happening in your world, and in fact, partly funding based on taxes. When a rocket launch happens, when we did the DART mission, there's people all over the world celebrating it, feeling like they're a part of this event. And this is a huge shift to how science has been done throughout history, right? It's deeply connected. in a way that allows for back and forth dialogue. We also have this commercialization. The idea that space is now for everyone has also led to the idea that it's open to privatization. During the Cold War, it was partly about demonstrating national superiority, but also there was this message that space is the place where there has been no war, where it's just about human achievement and what we can do. And sure, not everyone who said that believed it, but a lot of people who participated in the practice did, and still think that way today. Concerns over how we're going to change space going forward with privatization and commercialization are older than SpaceX. You can see on the left is some artist's imagining of what a colony might look like in a Martian lava tube. And on the right, I have maybe one of the more famous novels by Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth, which features a path into a hollow Earth passing through a lava tube that leads us to a prehistoric land. Jules Verne and Journey to the Center of the Earth is probably one of my reasons to start getting into science fiction. And Jules Verne himself had a deeply mixed feeling about how science was being done, and in particular with America and the idea of the inventor. He was amazed by what they could do, amazed by their ambition, their focus, or the scale at which they were willing to do things. But he was also deeply wary of what they wanted to do. For example, From the Earth to the Moon starts out as a purely human triumph story. Let's build a cannon because all these people in this artillery club are bored and they don't want to make cannons for war, but they still want to make cannons, so let's make a cannon that shoots people to the moon. And the government isn't going to do it, we have to do it. That method of actual, basically propulsion, projectile launching someone into space is not as unreal as it might seem. He did the math. It's not absurd when you look at it in the book. And there are some proposals to do similar things today for smaller payloads. The way he wrote Journey to the Center of the Earth, he was writing it at a time where the idea that the Earth was a molten core heating up was present, but not completely accepted. And he did the math and thought it was absurd because of how hot it would get, the immense pressure. And he's right, he just didn't believe it was possible. And part of how he wrote this, the professor in the book who leads this expedition, does the math on a lava tube chalkboard and explains why it's preposterous and why it's fine that they're going deeper and deeper. But one of his later stories, possibly involving the same characters, I can't remember it that well, is that these people who built a cannon to send people to the moon also decide to nuke the polar ice caps, to melt everything so that they can sell higher valued real estate. Some of you may recognize parts of this plot from Superman Returns, in another movie with deeply mixed reception. Of course, Elon Musk had said the same thing about Mars, and just couldn't help but remember, this is an idea more than a century old. Live with it today. I'm going to close. I don't actually know how I'm doing on time, but I'm going to start with one of these palimpsests that I love talking about, with Ibn Sina, otherwise known as Avicenna. In 980 Common Era, he had a thought experiment. What does it mean to be a human, or to be an individual? What if you had this person suspended in air, where he can't feel anything? He's still aware of himself, right? So the self exists. And part of his philosophy was thinking about this in terms of the soul and how this is proof of a soul, proof of God. And this idea, I think, therefore I am, it's seen as a precursor to Descartes' et cogito ergo sum. Someone else took this idea and, well, what does it mean to be human? Here you're talking about just identity and self, and you're talking about the absence of perception, but what about society? And Hay ibn Yaqzan is a later story about a boy who is somehow abandoned at birth on an island, raised by a gazelle, who, simply by observing the world around him, understands the world well enough to make his own tools, to live his own life. When a book washes ashore, he begins to understand language. And this course of, by simply observing what exists around me and using the tools made available by nature and circumstance, providence, he would come to know the world and come to know God. This is a book that was translated much later into English as The Improvement of Human Reason, exhibited in the life of Hay ibn Yaqzan, however they decided to translate that. And this came out very close to an account of a Scottish sailor, abandoned, who survived on his own on an island for a few months. Daniel Defoe read both of these in close succession and wrote The Life of and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, which sparked a whole genre, the Robinsonade. Once again, here we have a man abandoned, isolated from society, but still human, who is able to exist and thrive by careful observation of the world and understanding of his circumstance, and making the most of what Providence has given him. Those few tools that come from the ship, those few things that wash ashore, they are necessary, but enough. Swiss Family Robinson is another Robinsonade where a father was telling his children a version of Robinson Crusoe, except it was their family that was abandoned on the island. And his kids would interrupt and say, like, hey, there should be an ostrich here, or there should be a walrus. And so these bedtime interjections got substantial enough that he was actually encouraged to write it up as a book, which sold very well. And so you will see in a random vague island somewhere near Malaysia maybe, there are in fact walruses and ostriches because the kids wanted it. An adaptation or evolution of Swiss Family Robinson is Lost in Space. The Robinson family finds themselves abandoned, and simply by careful observation of the world and making the most of what circumstance and providence has given them in the form of a very helpful robot, they are able to survive and thrive. A very recent and popular Robinsonade is The Martian, where here providence is not God, but it's JPL. But once again, simply by understanding the world and carefully considering what is possible, you are able to survive and thrive. That's, like, you can see how we got from just what does it mean to be to here. Like, The Martian, I doubt Andy Weir has ever heard of, or maybe he's heard of, but I doubt he's read The Floating Man Experiment in the original language. He almost certainly has read Robinson Crusoe. He didn't have to read them for those ideas to be a part of this book. You don't have to have encountered any of some of the more obscure, like many of the things I've shown you. I don't know how many of you have heard of or read or engaged with these, but the ideas live around you. You live in a world where the idea of a baby sent on a rocket to another planet and has special powers because of the sun, you live in a world where that idea exists, and that idea exists because of an older idea. What stories we tell, of course, The Martian is deeply concerned with why do people engage with science the way they do. The only reason it's possible for JPL to send stuff is because people care about Mark Watney. It becomes this planetary project where we all care. The relationship between what it means to do science, what it means to understand the world, is deeply connected to how we understand our world at the time, while still informed by the layers of stories beneath. So with that, I think I'll leave it open to questions. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but...
Alrighty. So, who has some questions? Wonder if Jules Verne knew how far ahead of his own time he was. It's amazing.
There's a lot.
Yeah. We have any questions? Oh, we got one up at the front. So I'll bring the mics around. Tommy also has a mic so that everybody at home and in here can hear the questions.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm just curious how all of this connects with your postdoctoral work. You said, I think the doctor over there said your postdoctoral work was on how stars potentially affect the evolution of their planets.
The answer is very, very little. Like, some work I do is vaguely related to something other people do with Mars. Like, I work with Dave Brain, who's a scientist who understands how the magnetic fields of Mars protect its atmosphere. And one thing I do is provide Dave with models of what different stars might do. But yeah, that has absolutely nothing to do with this, really. Like, that's such a stretch.
So is this just inspiration?
I just really like stories.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
Thank you.
We got some folks over there. Yeah, we'll alternate back and forth.
Do the canals prove that there was water on Mars?
So the canals themselves, as they saw them back in the 1910s and 20s, were really just fuzzy blobs that were mostly mountains and canyons. Those canals aren't really proof of water on Mars. We have found, much later, with much higher resolution and much better telescopes and actually sending landers, we have seen riverbeds, we have seen lake beds, but the channels themselves were not proof of water on Mars.
Thank you so much. This is a bit of coming from the fringe, I guess, but I recently heard someone say on a podcast that human rhythms are more aligned with Mars than Earth.
I have no idea what that's supposed to mean.
Circadian rhythms.
So, okay, that I start to, so circadian rhythms, the idea that when we start to feel sleepy, there is a bit of a flexible range for what people might have. So there are some people where it might be long enough that it matches up with the Martian day, which I believe is 28 hours or 32, it's one of those. I myself actually, like, when I'm deep in the zone working, I live on a 28-hour day where I'll just go to sleep and wake up 2 hours later. I don't think that's common. It's probably, like, there is a medical condition called delayed phase sleep syndrome. But I will say that when people were operating the landers, people had to live on that time scale to operate it for months at a time, and then they'd take off shifts. So to answer your question, there are probably people whose circadian rhythms would make them more suitable for Mars. They exist. It is by no means common, and generally not medically advisable. I will say trying to schedule meetings when you're in the middle of that 28-hour day system is really, really hard.
All right. Oh, one right here. Excuse me. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Can you recommend any other speculative fiction novels like these that are, different, maybe not in this exact same vein, but also that, you find interesting or engaging or hopeful or anything like that?
I'll try not to overwhelm, and I'll try to keep
it.
So maybe if you find me after, there is a game I like to play where if you give me like 3 things, I try to come up with things that fit. So I'll pull the 3 things out of this talk. So one of these ideas being like these big scale projects, right? The idea of working on a generational time scale. Neil Stephenson is a guy who gets obsessed with particular academic things that are very, very different and writes very elaborate novels as an excuse to talk about those things. For example, he became very interested in epigenetics, which is how the human genome expresses differently depending on environmental circumstance. He also got really into one particular Renaissance era Nobel scientist who was working on the physics of how chains move and wrap around. And he also heard of these microscopic black holes that could be moving throughout space at any time. What if one just went through the moon? It would be bad, is the answer. And so Seven Eves is a story where most of the book is just the moon is breaking apart. We need to make a space colony to survive the hellfire that rains down on Earth. And because so much bad stuff happens during that, there are only 7 women left alive at the end. And to recreate the human race, they have to do some genetic engineering, hence the 7 Eves. And then the last chunk of the book is just like 2,000 years later, as people try to come back down to Earth. So I'll stop there.
All right, any other questions? Oh, right over here.
Hi there. Just want to say I love a good palimpsest, so I am familiar with that one. My son and I both read How to Mars by David Ebenbach.
I'm not
sure.
familiar.
It's relatively new. I think it was 2021, and I think it fits quite well into this and has a lot of humor as well with a guidebook on how to Mars with people from around the world. But as you were talking, I kept thinking about how the cultural, making sure the different people from around the world have a place to go, like their escape place, and it seems to be a thread too to continue that as well. So I was wondering if you often saw different types of people from different areas around the world in some of this fiction, or is it always, like American or Russian or Japanese or, okay.
So I will say that the Lady Astronaut of Mars series is, from its inception, an international space endeavor. So that program is a vision of, if by necessity, pre-Apollo, we pool together the resources of the entire world. And so that story is very multicultural. It plays into the novel significantly, how that affects things and the struggles that causes when trying to deal with very different groups of people, and some of whom very much don't like each other. But that's one example I'll point out. Seven Eves, again, international endeavor. A lot of these things where the Earth is being destroyed or will be destroyed tends to mean common cause across national boundaries. So nearly all of those stories end up with that.
Oh, we've got one more back here.
I was wondering, like Martian, what word you use for the denizens of Earth?
The traditional sci-fi term is Earthling. I don't know. Which is species agnostic, which I think is a good point. Like, trees are Earthlings too.
All right, well, let's give Dr. Duvvuri another hand for a fantastic talk. So he'll be around for a little while if you have some other questions that come into mind, but if you'd like to go up and view through the Seyfert telescope, we do have the moon up. It's pretty low right now, so you're not going to get this best view of it, but you're still going to get a pretty nice view of it. So we've got our exhibits inside. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And thank you all again for coming this evening. Hope to see you at our next event.